So it's been a while since I released an episode of Basic Lore for Dummies, but I realized this absolutely needed an episode, because like a lot of things, the Clone Wars misrepresents the films a lot. On top of its mentality that the movies they're basing things off of aren't good and they've got to change things, which is a terrible mentality to have. Anyways, Filoni groupies talk a lot about how the clone troopers were completely humanized, and for the prequel-hating bunch, they go on about how it was something the prequels failed to do, which of course they failed to realize that the overarching story wasn't about the clones. They were about, you know, the main characters, especially Anakin. But people didn't care, and despite there being no on-screen friendship between the Jedi and the clones, in which they're shown to be professional acquaintances at best, they still act all confused being like, huh? Why did the clones turn on the Jedi? And the explanation is in Attack of the Clones. But people always sleep on important lines. But based on how people describe their criticism about the clones not being humanized, they both miss the point and conform to the silly they should have done this or they should have done that mentality, which is not how you criticize any movie. Wanting something is not a substitute for a valid criticism, because what you want is your own personal fan fiction and not part of the author's story. Where I'm going with this is that people wanted the clones to be developed, then complained when the focus was placed on other stuff, and despite that, they still have the gall to complain that despite no on-screen chemistry, they can't buy that the clones would turn on the Jedi on a whim. It's bordering on contradiction, because people complain that the clones aren't shown bonding with the Jedi, but then they assume that the clones do have bonds with the Jedi. So it's arse backwards. But prequel hate is usually far from consistent. Obi-Wan and Cody were shown as professional acquaintances at best, and people assume they were friends. And why would Cody turn on his friend without hesitation? But the thing is, they weren't friends. They were professional acquaintances. The Clone Wars show turned them into close friends, which of course is what actually created the plot hole. And then to fill it, they contradict the movies again and made the whole story a mess. So I wanted to explain how the clone troopers actually worked. How a lot of ways people think about the clones are heavily based on misconceptions the Clone Wars created, and how it contradicts the films. And last of all, how the accurate depiction is actually way better. So to anyone who makes the previous contradiction of a complaint about the clones, you probably don't remember this important line from Attack of the Clones.
They are totally obedient, taking any order without question. We modified their genetic structure to make them less independent than the original host.
And no, being bored is not a valid excuse for missing it. Yeah, that's right. The clones are genetically modified to follow orders without question, and are less independent than Jango Fett. In a way, they are very close to droids, only organic, although they are obviously better at their jobs than droids. Like, maybe the only thing the Clone Wars got right was the droid to clone ratio. How the Separatist droid army was quantity, and the Republic clone army was quality. However, as I said, that's one of the only things they got right about clones. Clones were expensive, and they took half a lifetime to grow. It's referenced in Attack of the Clones that the initial clone army was in the millions. And for a galactic-wide conflict, that's pretty small. But back to the point at hand. The clones, as far as the movies show, are basically the organic brainwashed slave army of the Republic. And where TCW went wrong was portraying every single clone as independently working human beings with hopes and dreams. Doesn't sound bad on paper, but remember that it contradicts the movies. And the thing is, they missed the point. With this level of independence, you could technically say the clones are choosing to fight the war, and it doesn't seem too hard to defect from the army if one wants to. Cutler Quain wasn't exactly making himself hidden, and the thing is, they don't really elaborate on the consequences of deserting. Rex just has disdain for him, but changes his mind about him at the end, and nothing else comes of it. Then if you include the Sad Batch into the mix, the Clone Commando Squad knew about Cutler Quain and were close with him and his family. So yeah, at least 6 clones knew about Cutler Quain and not one of them reported him. It gives the impression that it doesn't really matter if you leave the Grand Army of the Republic. In the end, it's really the clones' choice, regardless of their upbringing. I also remember Heavy in Season 3 planning to ditch his training and become a free man, and there wasn't really a lot of security. So this concept the show itself tries to push later on about the clones being slaves of the Republic doesn't work. In essence, they only became slaves once the inhibitor chips kicked in. And speaking of inhibitor chips, they just break the universe. It was meant to fill in a non-existent plot hole and ended up just creating one. For some reason, the clones are made independent, right until Order 66 is given, and the clones become mindless drones or whatever. Why are the Kaminoans and the Sith that stupid? Obviously, this was incredibly close to backfiring, as seen in the Season 6 arc. You'd expect the Order to activate prematurely. Although, to be honest, it doesn't make sense because Order 66 was a contingency order out of 150. Why is it Order 66 specifically the order that was issued? Or did Dave Filoni think that Order 66 was literally the 66th order given during the Clone Wars, which is a misconception I used to have when I was like 8. I mean, in the films, Palpatine doesn't explain the context of the order. He gives it and expects each clone commander to know about it. So that indicates that the clones memorized the contingency orders. The Clone Wars had no idea what it was doing, and just assumed that Order 66 was something that the clones knew nothing about, when actually no, they did, alongside the other 149.
The time has come. Execute Order 66.
The inhibitor chips was literally an excuse for Dave Filoni to look like a hero for explaining a non-existent plot hole, and at the same time, giving himself an excuse to write his favorite clones like Rex out of Order 66. Is it any coincidence Rex, Wolf, and Gregor specifically avoided Order 66 come Star Wars Rebels? Filoni didn't want those clones doing the bad thing, and therefore, he completely missed the point. Now let me clearly explain to you the purpose of the clones in-universe. They were basically sleeper agents for the Sith. They showed up extremely conveniently at the start of a galactic-wide war, and the Jedi were tricked into leading them into battle, thinking the Separatists were the Sith cause, and not realizing the Sith in actuality played both sides the whole time. Why else did Count Dooku publicly show himself as a Sith? It was to misdirect the Jedi. But back to the clones, the Jedi had to rely on the clones to win battles, as one Jedi cannot take on the Separatist armies and militias alone. The Jedi began to trust the clones, relying on them more and more, and then 3 years later, when the war was nearly over, and the Jedi were confident the Sith would be defeated at last, the last thing they expected is that the clones were never loyal to them. They were loyal to the Sith. And so, majority of them died across the galaxy. And when you think about it, it's actually pretty clever. Jedi like Ki-Adi-Mundi were fighting the Separatists. And even if he evaded the clones, he'd have to evade the droid army as well. Order 66 survivors either sensed the threat just in time, or narrowly survived. I remember in the DS version of the Revenge of the Sith game, Obi-Wan even made an offhand remark about how he shouldn't have trained the clones so well. And that's the thing. The clones outnumbered the Jedi, and each legion assigned to a Jedi knew exactly what their Jedi was like, and made it easier to thin them out. Most of each Jedi found themselves all alone and confused. Keep in mind that they didn't know why the clones turned on them, until it was either too late, or they managed to completely escape. Most surviving Jedi wouldn't even know the whole truth. They'd just have to assume the Sith had something to do with it, given the Empire took over right after this event. The key point was that the clones were never on their side. They were once again sleeper agents for the Sith. Hardly any of them were independent unless they were like ARC troopers or commandos, since those clones specifically were bred with independent genes. As specialists, they needed it, and with that independence, they actually had the capability to defect or disobey Order 66. However, you shouldn't think of the average rank-and-file clone trooper having limited independence as something that ruins the story, because there were plenty of ARC troopers and commandos to hold you over if you really wanted the clones to be humanized. The video game Republic Commando is a good place to start, and the thing is, the average clone troopers were still slaves, just not in the way TCW presented it. The average clone trooper was still human beings, even without full independence. They still felt pain, they still had thoughts, and they were still alive. They just didn't know any better than the Republic Army, and they basically could not do anything else. That is the cold reality of the slave army of the Republic. This is some dystopian 1984 shit. Clones who can't think independently, yet still come with all the other traits of a human. Unable to escape because they don't know any better, and they can never know any better. That's how the movies, plus the expanded universe, portray these guys. And that's far more tragic and sad than the kindergarten goo that is the Clone Wars. The thing is, the original version is much better for in-universe explanations and for storytelling. Remember that the complete saga was not about the clones. It was about Anakin Skywalker and surrounding characters. I'm just sick of people thinking that clone troopers should follow TCW's flawed, simplistic ideas of what the clones are, and not thinking about how little sense it makes in-universe, and how poorly written it is where they completely miss the trick. Well, that's my in-depth assessment of how the clones really work. I'm JJ Plagiarisms, and until next time, what are stories about mystery boxes?
Under the mountain.